emerged during this. A secondary meaning emerged during this same period as well, shadowing the first. Virtuosity could also name the questionable expertise of the hobbyist or dabbler. The virtuoso has thus been both genius and dilettante, expert and amateur, artist and huckster, and these rival meanings are resumed within the anxious figure of the musical prodigy in his final romantic form, an artistic celebrity who could represent both cheerful mastery and deceptive mockery. As Susan Bernstein notes in her study of 19th century virtuosity, English and German dictionaries from the time stress the reversibility of expertise into empty dilettantism and the display of technical skill for its own sake. Rumored to have sold his soul for otherworldly abilities, Paganini, for instance, deliberately broke his violin strings during concerts, demonstrating his genius by continuing to play the damaged instrument perfectly. The performance hovers uncertainly between a work of genius and a cheap trick. Just what does virtuosity mean in poetry, though? Literary criticism's few sustained engagements with the concept usually contract out its meaning to music history, focusing on the virtuoso as a socio-historical figure. Otherwise, virtuosity and its cognates appear mostly in the garb of colloquial aesthetic judgment, with performance retained only as a ghostly metaphor. One scholar notes, for instance, the virtuosic literary cubism of Gertrude Stein. Another observes the technical virtuosity of James Merrill's sonnets as the failing of his early poetry. Closer to the tract of land plotted for today's discussion, witness Richard Chevenix's Trench in a statement collected in his letters and memorials on Alfred Tennyson. I wonder whether his exquisite finish and virtuosity of language will live, Trench writes. In Memoriam, for instance, it reminds one of Virgil, the unexpectedness of language. Meanwhile, Ernest Clarence Stedman, in his anthology Victorian Poets, hints, unintentionally it should be said, at the risks of technical brilliance when he describes William Morris as, quote, so well equipped a virtuoso and so facile a rhythmist as was necessary for producing the earthly paradise. Though virtuosity sometimes carries with it the ambivalence of its etymology, nonetheless, the term names on these occasions nothing more than the resident poet's particular gift in the judgment of the critic. Ordinarily, virtuosity's ambiguous appeal depends on effects that must be realized in performance or public display. The elision of composition and performance in poetry, then, makes the distinctiveness of poetic virtuosity an even less clear proposition. In his essay, The Possibility of a Poetic Drama, in 1921, T.S. Eliot echoes Wagner when he worries about the instability of any art which depends on representation by performers. The performer, he writes, is interested not in form, but in opportunities for virtuosity or in the communication of his personality. The formlessness, the lack of intellectual clarity and distinction in modern music, the great physical stamina and physical training which it often requires, are perhaps signs of the triumph of the performer. One can detect, of course, Eliot's usual concerns here about personality, tradition, and form, as well as some trepidation about his own artistic ambitions. The division between the composition and performance stands at odds with the wholeness or coherence of the poem as a work of art. The philosopher and pianist Thomas Carson Mark has written helpfully on the difference between the virtuosic performance and what he calls the work of virtuosity, in which the display of skill enters essentially into the nature of the work, shaping it and providing artistic subject. There are artworks in which technical skill is an important ingredient, not merely as something required to produce the artwork, but in the deeper sense that it penetrates and partly determines the nature of the artwork itself. The Chopin etudes, for example, are generally admitted to be masterpieces of music, but it is obvious that the development and display of skill in piano playing enters essentially into their composition. Indeed, piano playing is what the etudes are about. As another example, consider the still life paintings by various Dutch artists of the 17th century, in which such objects as crystal goblets, jewelry, glass spheres, dewdrops, and oysters on the half shell are consummately represented. Whatever else is true of them, these pictures show a deliberate collecting of hard-to-paint items whose convincing representation counts as a display of the skill of the painter. Or consider the intricate polyphonic music of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. The rondeau of Machaut, for example, in which the top two voices are inverted mirror images of each other, and the third voice is a perfect palindrome. Mark's definition goes some way to making virtuosity coherent for an art like poetry or painting. Not only must incredible skill go into the making of the work, but the work must display that skill as part of its subject matter. The work of virtuosity celebrates the artist's mastery of their medium. In Mark's terms, then, the virtuosic poet must make their grasp of the medium visible to the reader as a testament to skill. Another part of the difficulty, though, is that what makes poetry, well, poetry with a capital P, is the way it exceeds its own medium. Otherwise, as Herbert Tucker suggests in a recent essay, it's just verse. Mere verse, he writes, is what we call a poem that has not escaped its dependency on the formal verse medium. Yet virtuosity calls attention to that medium in ways that might be seen to threaten the integrity of the work as an artistic whole. Thus, alluding to new critical hostility to much Victorian poetry, Tucker observes that, quote, Victorian poems were so relentlessly verse, in fact, that it was easy for the mid-20th century to write them off as merely that, verse and nothing more. The two terms of my title thus make natural partners in more ways than one. Both verse and virtuosity rest somewhat uneasily in their respective places within hierarchies of evaluation. Both can serve as backhanded compliments. Both are readily qualified as mere verse or mere virtuosity. Both introduce an element of uncertainty into our efforts at appraisal. If they help to set the terms of artistic excellence, they can also imply or threaten a certain emptiness. That is, to talk about virtuosity in poetry is, potentially, to talk about verse and nothing more, to separate out the merely technical from the properly artistic in the centrifuge of educated judgment. With this in mind, my argument today turns on what we might call the emptiness of poetic virtuosity, in which the signal rhetorical gesture is one of disclaiming poetry in favor of mere verse. Indeed, Victorian poets routinely invoke the notion of verse at those moments when they want or need to register matters of skill on the aesthetic balance sheet. From the economic mourning work of elegy, where daring too much artistry might dishonor the effort at memorialization, to the complicit mockery of parody, where the skill of both the poet and her target are dangerously co-implicated, the figure of verse often appears when the madeness of the poet's work is at issue. I'll turn now to Alfred Tennyson, probably the Victorian poet most likely to generate that balance of praise and censure owed to the virtuoso, at least until his successor Algernon Charles Swinburne entered the scene in the 1860s. Even before our poet made his public debut, the marvelous pastiche of his faux Elizabethan drama, The Devil and the Lady, announced a child prodigy's grasp of the medium and its conventions, so complete that, as Herbert Tucker puts it, quote, there seemed no important growing left for him to do in the arts of versification, end quote. Tennyson's writing regularly displays the ingenuity of the poet's metrical gifts in ways that bring the action of the poem down to its generic and formal mediations. The intricately patterned stanzas of his early poems, for instance, or his experiments with ballad forms in Oriana and the Lady of Shalott, or his exercises in classical quantitative meter in such verses as Leonine Elegiacs, Anacreontics, and Milton Alcaics. Tennyson often felt, somehow, it's kind of surprising, that his metrical accomplishments were overlooked by reviewers. His poem Hendecasyllabics, written in the meter of the Roman poet Catullus, was one of two attempts at classic meters in quantity, published in 1863 as a response to this neglect, and it joins other such distempered occasional poems as To Christopher North and The New Timon and the Poets among Tennyson's small collection of poetic replies to his critics. Here's the poem entire. O you chorus of indolent reviewers, irresponsible, indolent reviewers, look, I come to the test, a tiny poem all composed in a meter of Catullus, all in quantity, careful of my motion, like the skater on ice that hardly bears him, lest I fall unawares before the people, waking laughter in indolent reviewers. Should I flounder a while without a tumble through this metrification of Catullus, they should speak to me not without a welcome, all that chorus of indolent reviewers. Hard, hard, hard it is, only not to tumble. So fantastical is the dainty meter. Wherefore, slight me not wholly, nor believe me too presumptuous, indolent reviewers. O blatant magazines, regard me rather, since I blush to belaud myself a moment, as some rare little rose, a piece of inmost horticultural art, or half coquette-like maiden not to be greeted unbenignly. Tennyson's remarkably agile performance, the meter truly is a stunning exhibit of the poet's ability, speaks in the voice not of the poet, but of the poem itself, which, in this case, is wholly identified with its metrical form. The poem is meant straightforwardly as a display of virtuosity. Its subject is the difficulty of its own achievement. Each of the figures the poem uses to characterize itself furthers this impression. It is like the skater on ice that hardly bears him, and also like some rare little rose, a piece of inmost horticultural art. Tennyson could put this ability to much more serious uses, though, and did, particularly in the writing of elegy. The fine finish of his poetry was always a source of consternation among his readers, who noted the poet's gift for spinning out lines of verse with a perfection verging on the mechanical. When In Memoriam was published, his friend Edward Fitzgerald remarked in a letter to Frederick Tennyson, quote, "It is full of finest things, but it is monotonous and has that air of being evolved by a poetical machine of the highest order." Fair. And T.S. Eliot echoed Fitzgerald, perhaps consciously, when he lamented, quote, that Tennyson, who might unquestionably have been a consummate master of minor forms, took to turning out large patterns on a machine, end quote. Lacking even the pathos of self-consciousness, the virtuosic poet becomes here nothing more than an enormous versifying weaver's loom, producing poetry as whole cloth. Yet Tennyson was himself keenly aware that the excellence of his verse-making might undermine the quality of feeling in his poems, particularly when those poems were elegies. In Memoriam, as Louis Menand writes, was, quote, an exercise in the management of a dangerous emotion, end quote. And the poem is shot through with references to its material mediations, references that tend to set verse and feeling productively at odds. Tennyson was indeed worried about the imperfectness of his elegy. He wrote to his aunt in 1847 to insist the poem was not yet adequate to its occasion. Perhaps he recalled his own lines to his friend James Spedding on the death of his brother. Quote, "Words weaker than your grief would make grief more," end quote. Throughout In Memoriam, Tennyson describes his work as a poor flower of poesy, as mere verses, mournful rhymes. In the famous lines of section 5, he invokes the verse medium of the poem in order specifically to preserve the feelings it ought to embody and cannot. I sometimes hold it half a sin to put in words the grief I feel, for words, like nature, half reveal and half conceal the soul within. But for the unquiet heart and brain, a use in measured language lies, the sad mechanic exercise, like dull narcotics, numbing pain. In words, like weeds, I'll wrap me o'er, like coarsest clothes against the cold. But that large grief which these enfold is given in outline, and no more. Paul Verlaine notably complained of Tennyson's elegy. When he should have been broken-hearted, he had many reminiscences, that is, literary allusions. Yet Tennyson not only recognizes this problem himself, but goes still further, making the dilemma of poetic virtuosity the very subject of his poem. The sad mechanic exercise through which the poet dulls the edge of pain anticipates Edward Fitzgerald's complaint about Tennyson's poetical machine, and the weave of the poet's measured language is cut in the final quatrain into coarsest clothes, the appropriate garb of mourner's weeds. The apologetic decorum of reticence in this section, as Tucker describes it, facilitates the proper expression of loss. In this respect, the poem becomes a work of virtuosity, as Thomas Carson Mark defines it, not simply a display of technical mastery, but a poem very much about that mastery. Sometimes verse can enter places where poetry might fear to tread. In disclaiming poetry for mere verse, Tennyson offers the compensations of the formal medium itself as the only adequate response to loss. Swinburne, Tennyson's great successor in technical excess, was, of course, the late 19th century's principal figure for virtuosity in poetry. The word virtuosity appears just twice in the third volume of George Saintsbury's 1910 A History of English Prosody, and both times it is given to Swinburne. There could be no question, Saintsbury declares, of his preeminence in prosodic virtuosity. His poems, quote, establish a prosodic record, not exactly for the invention with which he has sometimes been credited, still less for any innovation on the general principles of English prosody, but for the unsurpassed versatility and virtuosity in adapting, varying, managing the great materials and means with which he and his lesser fellows were now furnished, end quote. As Saintsbury suggests, virtuosity is the function not of originality, but of imitation, adapting, varying, and managing one's materials and means. Like Tennyson, Swinburne's poetry is replete with figures of versification. Indeed, perhaps no Victorian poet so relentlessly figured his own verses, which appear in his writing as leaves, rags, burial shrouds, wings, shells, petals, feathers, notes of song, and butterflies. Here's a brief run of some of my favorite passages to this effect. From The Triumph of Time, have I not built thee a grave, and wrought thy grave clothes on thee of grievous thought, with soft spun verses and tears unshed, and sweet light visions of things undone? From Felice, for many loves are good to see, mutable loves and loves perverse, but there is nothing, nor shall be, so sweet, so wicked, but my verse can dream of worse. And then two favorites from two much less read Swinburne poems that I love dearly. But this one broken foam white feather, I throw you off the hither wing, splashed stiff with sea scurf and salt weather, this song for sleep to learn and sing. And this last, A Dark Month, which is elderly Swinburne hanging out with Theodore Watts Dunton, deeply upset because a young child won't be around him for a full month. So he writes a poem for every single day of the month and collects it under this title. A firefly tenders to the father of fires a tribute something worth. My verse, a shard-born beetle rather, drones over scarce illumined earth. Swinburne's poems, in his poems, are never poems, but verses, or one of the many metaphors he summons to figure the verse medium. Swinburne's relationship to his medium involves a disappearing act, not only the poem, but the poet too, disappearing under waves of verse. The most profound of Swinburne's disappearing acts was that of parody. Swinburne was perhaps the most gifted imitator of English poetry, producing disturbingly exact replicas of poetry by friends and foes alike. His parody of Tennyson's The Higher Pantheism catches the poet laureate at his most Edward Lear-like. One who is not we see, but one whom we see not is. Surely this is not that, but that is assuredly this. The stuffy nonsense that Swinburne draws out of Tennyson also pushes the matter of style into the foreground. Parody might be described as poetic virtuosity's most self-aware form. The subject of parody is not so much the faults of the object being parodied, or even its style more generally, so much as the parodist's own skill. In this respect, the danger of parody is also identical with that of virtuosity. It enacts at the level of style the anxiety that Tennyson acknowledges in In Memoriam, gleefully converting poetry into nothing more than a sad mechanic exercise. Swinburne, though, did not simply parody other writers, nor was parody for him an exercise merely. Indeed, he parodied himself with an exuberance that can still surprise today, arraigning his own style in the court of imitation. Poeta Loquitur is probably the best known of Swinburne's several self-parodies, a remarkable piece of writing that picks up one of his most persistent stanzas, 7 lines of loosely anapestic trimeter tied off with a final line of dimeter, and turns it into a joke that rivals Paul Muldoon's haiku. First, though, its sources. This particular octave's earliest appearance is in Swinburne's scandalous poem Dolores. Cold eyelids that hide like a jewel, hard eyes that grow soft for an hour, the heavy white limbs and the cruel red mouth with a venomous flower. When these are gone by with their glories, what shall rest of thee then? What remain, O mystic and somber Dolores, Our Lady of Pain? Swinburne borrowed his own stanza for the dedicatory poem to Poems and Ballads in 1866, a sort of extended envoy for the book as a whole. And here, verse-making becomes his specific topic. Though to eschews the scandalous thematics of Dolores, this too is a poem of devotion, the poet given over to his poetry and his poems to their life adrift on the seas of public circulation. The sea gives her shells to the shingle, the earth gives her streams to the sea. They are many, but my gift is single, my verses, the first fruits of me. Let the wind take the green and the gray leaf, cast forth without fruit upon air. Take rose leaf and vine leaf and bay leaf, blown loose from the hair. The night shakes them round me in legions, dawn drives them before her like dreams. Time sheds them like snows on strange regions, swept shoreward on infinite streams. Leaves pallid and somber and ruddy, dead fruits of the fugitive years, some stained as with wine and made bloody, and some as with tears. In repeating his own stanzaic innovation, Swinburne suggests the detachability of style from the poet and even from the poem. Disclaiming poetry and referring to his writing as verse, he insists only on the activity of making itself. Over the course of the poem, these verses become leaves, snows, wings, rhymes, flocks of birds. The metaphorical transformations of Swinburne's verses repeatedly return us to the medium itself. That medium then becomes an entire landscape when Swinburne revives this stanza yet again for By the North Sea in 1880. An extended meditation in 7 sections, the poem depicts the coast of Dunwich, which serves as the inspiration for so many of Swinburne's poems of sea and shore. A land that is lonelier than ruin, a sea that is stranger than death, far fields that a rose never blew in, wan waste where the winds lack breath, waste endless and boundless and flowerless, but of marsh blossoms fruitless as free, where earth lies exhausted, as powerless to strive with the sea. The endless repetitions of Swinburne's verses are a waste endless and boundless and flowerless. Verse and landscape come to resemble one another, twin emptinesses that might just go on forever. Like Swinburne's dedication, By the North Sea is poignant as both mythos and poetic, so it must have been some surprise for readers to stumble on Poeta Loquitur, after which we'll leave Swinburne behind as well. If a person conceives an opinion that my verses are stuff that will wash, or my muse has one plume in her pinion, that person's opinion is bosh. My philosophy, politics, free thought are worth not 3 skips of a flea, and the emptiest thoughts that can be thought are mine on the sea. In a maze of monotonous murmur, where reason roves ruined by rhyme, in a voice neither graver nor firmer than the bells of a fool's cap chime, a party pretentiously pensive, with a muse that deserves to be skinned, makes language and meter offensive, with rhymes on the wind. Where Tennyson invokes the verse medium as a stay against feeling, Swinburne commits himself to the exercise itself, and finds there, with something like exhilaration, that the exercise is enough. The poet inhabits his own style as style. His verses both are and little typo. His verses both are and act out the maze of monotonous murmur he constructs there. His would-be maleficent verses are nothing but wind, he writes in the final stanza, arguably the archest joke about flatulence in the English poetic canon. And with that, I'll turn finally to the Parnassians, who borrowed Swinburne's disappearing act for their own pursuit of lyric form. Perhaps no group of writers pursued the excellence of verse to the peril of their literary historical afterlives quite so assiduously as the English Parnassians. In his gossipy memoir, The Romantic 90s, the decadent poet Richard Le Gallienne referred to them as, quote, poets of bric-a-brac and blue china, and those old French forms of ballade, rondeau, violet, and the like. Indeed, the principal Parnassians, Edmund Gosse, Andrew Lang, and Austin Dobson, produced large quantities of ornate poems, often in medieval French forms, and they generally look to us, as they look to their modernist successors, like the pale attenuation of whatever had once been vital in Victorian poetry. Theirs is a poetry of formal pastiche, and the anxieties around their archival formalism were considerable. Could mere verse yield poetry? Thus, Austin Dobson insists, in his essay, A Note on Some Foreign Forms of Verse, that genuine inspiration and emotion do indeed express or exhibit themselves in stereotyped shapes and set refrains. Andrew Lang is remarkable among these writers for his skepticism on this front. Le Gallienne quotes a passage from Lang, a casual quatrain about his own books of poetry, which Le Gallienne claims for the poet's dread of rhetorical gesture, a fear of taking himself too seriously. They were scribbled in sketchbooks or flybooks, in lectures on locks by the seas. And wherefore do people who buy books go purchasing these? Attentive ears will hear the prosodic allusion in Lang's self-deprecation. It arrives from Poeta Loquitur, and the entire chain of reflections on verse-making that Swinburne derived from that stanza. The poem was titled On an Expensive Volume of Verse, and it continues thus. A scholar was I, in the way to be idle with pencil and pen, and I rhymed while the master read Plato, of Phaeacian men. When the Ettrick was sullenly frozen, with snows on the hills and the plain, the tune for my singing was chosen, of the sirens again. On ladies that never existed, or never in space and in time, I founded my fancies and twisted the strands of a rhyme. It was evil example that brought me to rhyme and to run on the row, and Swinburne and Tennyson taught me whatever I know. Lang's poem lops off the last 4 lines of Swinburne's octave and welds a whole series of his scavenged quatrains together into a poem that exemplifies the relation between verse and virtuosity. Disclaiming poetry in favor of mere verse, Lang offers nothing but the pleasures of the medium itself. What Lang learned from Swinburne were strategies of imitation, parody, and pastiche that pointedly marked the formal medium through a kind of authorial dispossession. These parodic stanzas sacrifice their author's poetic achievements in exchange for a celebration of their medium and the virtuosity that belongs most properly to verse. The poetry of Parnassus can seem one of the emptiest bodies of work, an arcade of antique forms that offers little more than the endless variation of their materials. But Lang understood the costs of virtuosity all too well. I'll end with a bit from his Ballad on a Choice of a Sepulchre, which requests that the poet be laid to rest where the wide-winged hawk doth hover. That line is the poem's refrain, a line that circles in the holding pattern of the ballade form, much as the wide-winged hawk wheels in the air above. Bring me here, life's tired-out guest, to the blessed bed that waits the weary rover. Here should failure be confessed. Ends my quest, where the wide-winged hawk doth hover. The imaginative resting place toward which the poet aspires is nothing more than verse itself. If poems like these confess over and over their failure as poetry, they evince their delight in something like mere form, a virtuosic retrieval of the verse medium itself as an ideal.